Hello and welcome to lecture number 14 in our course on project stakeholder management. And in this lecture I'm going to continue from where I left off in the last lecture, in which I had started talking about the project stakeholder management and engagement governance model. And I had pointed out that there are 5 steps: the institutional step, the directional step, the instrumental or methodological step, then there is the technical step, and there is the educational step. Now, what I want to do in this class is I just want to first start continuing off with the process framework model, which I had introduced in the last lecture. And you remember that colorful diagram which I gave there, these various steps: understanding the project context, identifying the stakeholders, analyzing the stakeholders and their impact on the project, designing a stakeholder engagement strategy, and implementing a stakeholder engagement and management strategy. These were the 5 steps. Well, this is basically a logical sequence which you would find with regards to stakeholder management and engagement on most projects where this is being practiced. Stakeholder management and engagement, that is. This is my own framework, but of course it draws a lot upon existing practices. It draws a lot also upon existing frameworks, one of which I would like to introduce to you here. That is from our old acquaintances, Cleland and Ireland, which we have already talked about quite a bit with regards to the categorization of stakeholders. Well, Cleland and Ireland, they also have developed a stakeholder management and engagement framework some time ago. And I have brought an illustration of it. It's given here on the left side of this slide. It's taken from their book, Project Management, Strategic Design and Implementation, which I recommend as a reading book for all students who are studying project management. Very insightful. And it also does not go too much into the technical details, but it looks more at the conceptual underpinnings of project management. Coming back here to stakeholder management and engagement, look at this circle which Cleland and Ireland have presented over here. You can see it's composed basically of 3 layers. Here is a innermost layer that is the representing the project management team. Then you have got a second layer around this innermost layer. These are various functions which the project management team is supposed to perform. And then you have the third outermost layer, which are basically, you could say, various phases of work which the project management team is supposed to do with regards to managing and engaging project stakeholders. Now, you remember also from a previous one of the previous classes I had told you that stakeholder management is a collective responsibility. It is not just the responsibility of one or more categories of stakeholders, such as the project manager or the project team, as it is given over here, but actually it's the responsibility of all stakeholders. Here, the project management team, they have got very within their framework of responsibilities, they have got very specific functions which they have got to perform, and which is also shown over here, and which is consistent largely with what I have presented in my own framework. For instance, the identification of stakeholders, that is given over here in this segment as a responsibility of the project management team. Gathering information on stakeholders is another responsibility. Identifying the stakeholders' mission, especially with regards to the project, is another responsibility. Determining stakeholder strengths and weaknesses. Identifying stakeholder strategy, how to deal with stakeholders, and predicting stakeholder behavior, as well as implementing stakeholder management strategy. So you can see all these responsibilities in the framework of Cleland and Ireland, which the project management team has with regards to project stakeholders. These are very consistent with my own framework. But again, as I pointed out, please remember that stakeholder management and engagement is a collective responsibility. It is not the responsibility of one or more stakeholders. Here one will get the mistaken impression that this is the responsibility solely of the project management team, which it's not. Other stakeholders, whether they are clients, users, senior executives, whether they are architects, consultants, contractors, subcontractors, government agencies, they all have their role to play. It doesn't mean that they're all going to perform these functions over here, but certainly they do have to manage and engage within their own specific frameworks, within their own specific part of the project. So this was one framework which I just thought I should introduce to you over here, and there are also other ones, but more or less they're all going in this direction. It's, as I said, a logical sequence of actions about understanding your context, identifying your stakeholders, analyzing your stakeholders, and then coming up with appropriate strategies to manage and engage your stakeholders. Well, coming back to my stakeholder management and engagement process framework, what are some of the basic functions which it fulfills? I mean, in other words, what is the utility of this framework? Why have it? Why have a special framework just for managing and engaging stakeholders? Why not just manage and engage them on an ad hoc basis, you know, as things develop, as the project develops, as it goes from conception to initiation, to planning, to execution, to closure, and then into operation? Well, there is a very good reason for having a stakeholder management and engagement process framework with all the steps: contextualization and identification, analysis, and strategy design, strategy implementation, etc. For starters, such a framework, it provides a deep understanding of the project's stakeholder community and the distinguishing attributes of the stakeholder community, the identity of the stakeholders, the degree of heterogeneity, homogeneity, the spatial dispersion of the stakeholders, their power interest constellations, attitudes, behaviors, expectations, options, etc., etc., etc. So with the help of this process framework, what you can do is you can systematically you can gather information on your stakeholders, and it will give you insight into your stakeholders, especially with regards to their interfacing with the project. All the details, all the aspects which are relevant for stakeholder interfacing with the project, they will be examined, investigated, documented with the help of this process framework. For instance, how homogeneous or how heterogeneous is the stakeholder community? Homogeneity, heterogeneity has also got different dimensions. Heterogeneous, for example, in attitudes and behaviors. You have a broad spectrum of attitudes and behaviors towards the project, ranging from very supportive to very hostile. Or heterogeneity also in the sense of how many different types of or categories of types of stakeholders do you have. You have like a lot of subcontractors maybe, or contractors and architects and consultants and government agencies, etc., etc., very heterogeneous. Or do you just have maybe a small project which is being conducted within an organization where you just have maybe 2 or 3 departments involved, so it is relatively homogeneous. Spatial dispersion, where are all the stakeholders? Are they all concentrated in one locality, in one office, in one building, in one town, in one city? Or are they spread all over the place? Like, for example, in an outsourcing project or in a mega project where you have stakeholders which are spread all over the place, nationally and across borders, maybe across continents even. Power interest constellations. What this basically means are combinations of power and interest. You have some stakeholders who are very powerful in the sense that they can exert a strong influence on the project. The senior manager or a top manager or a president of an organization is very powerful, can say, well, you know, this project, we should scrap it. It's not worth it. It's not going to bring many benefits for our organization. Let's not pursue it. Power in the sense of exerting influence on the project. You have some stakeholders who could be very powerful, and they can exert a lot of influence. You have other stakeholders who are not powerful and who have not much influence on the project. And when you have this constellation of power and interest, that means you're taking two variables here. You're taking basically the power variable and you're taking the interest variable. What is the intensity or what is the level of interest which a stakeholder has on a project? You might have a stakeholder which is very powerful and has a lot of interest in your project. Senior manager again or sponsor might say, okay, I'm in favor of your project and I'm very interested in it. Keep me informed. I'm following it very closely. Vice versa also. And you might have a stakeholder who is not powerful but who's also very interested in your project. You may have a stakeholder who's very powerful, has no interest in your project. So you have these different combinations over here of power and interest. High power, high interest, high power, low interest, low power, high interest, and so forth. You know, there are different combinations. This framework, Project Stakeholder Management Process Framework, also gives you insights into attitudes and behaviors of stakeholders. Are the stakeholders for or against your project? And there are all kinds of tools which you can use to find out. You can conduct surveys, you can conduct interviews, you can ask third parties, you can do background research, and so forth. All this is catered for under this process framework as a process. You can also find out the expectations of stakeholders with regards to your project. What do they expect from your project? Do they expect it's going to have a very, for example, positive impact on the community? Do they expect it's going to bring a lot of economic benefits, or is it going to bring a lot of cultural benefits, etc., etc.? What options do they have to influence your project? Soft options, hard options, which we'll look at in a later class. All these you can find out as a result of applying this Project Stakeholder Management Process Framework. It would be very difficult to do all this without it, because this provides a systematic basis for actually going around and finding out all these details. A second basic function which this Project Stakeholder Management Process Framework does is that it helps the internal project stakeholders design and implement an effective strategy to try to manage and engage the stakeholder community systematically and efficiently in the best interest of the project. This framework, the various steps, designing a strategy, implementing a strategy, and the various processes which are associated with that, which are refined and modified and improved over time. Well, basically they all aim to help the stakeholders, the internal stakeholders, come up with good strategies. Good in the sense that they are effective, in the sense that they are efficient, and in the sense that they are systematic, and they take into account all the factors which we have just talked about, such as, for example, power interest constellations, or attitudes and behaviors, or expectations, and so forth. So this is all a very systematic framework based on processes which are carefully documented and which are revised and modified and improved over time to effectively and efficiently manage and engage the project stakeholders. Another function which this stakeholder management and engagement process framework fulfills is it helps reduce or minimize the risk to the project stemming from possible negative intervention actions by project stakeholders. Well, you remember when I showed you that diagram of the process framework, I also pointed out that there is a need for a proactive approach, an anticipatory approach. You look ahead, you look forward, you try to anticipate how stakeholders are going to behave. Behavior translates into options, exercising of options. If you are behaving very negatively towards a project, for instance, then there are various options which you could use to express your negativity. For instance, going to the courts or going to the administration or organizing a boycott and so forth and so forth. Well, what this framework does is it looks at the different stakeholders, it identifies them, identifies their attitudes and behaviors. What is the reason for their attitude and behavior? If a stakeholder is against your project, why is the stakeholder against your project? There must be some underlying reason for that. The same way, if a stakeholder supports your project, there also is some underlying reason for that. So one has to look at all these underlying reasons and factors, and then one has to come up with some kind of strategy, some kind of measures which will reduce the feelings of negativity towards the project and increase the feelings of the positive feelings with regards to the project. There are all processes for that, and this is where this process framework can help minimize, reduce the risk to the project, which is good, because the less risk to the project, the higher the chance that it's going to be completed within its given scope, cost, time parameters, as well as to the satisfaction of all its key stakeholders. The process framework also has the function of providing insight into opportunities for projects through interaction with its stakeholders. The whole purpose is not only to look at the negative side, to identify the threat, which we call negative risks in project management towards the project, but also to look into the positive side, to look into the opportunities for the project, for which we use the term positive risks in project management. Positive risks, opportunities, threats are negative risks. So we not only want to try and understand why stakeholders are against the project, what options they have to negatively influence the project and what to do about it, but we also want to see what kind of opportunities there are with the project, which is very good, because by identifying such opportunities and by coming up with a mechanism to tap into or exploit such opportunities, then the good feeling of the stakeholders towards the project will be increased. In other words, you may have some supportive stakeholders who will become more supportive, or you may have some stakeholders who might have been indifferent or neutral, maybe even mildly adversarial, but when they see that these opportunities are there and that they can also benefit from these opportunities vis-a-vis the project, then they will become more supportive of the project. Another function of this stakeholder management process framework is to show the project stakeholder situation at any point in time during the project and its constituent phases. Initiation, planning, execution, and so forth, and there are sub-phases and so forth. Well, stakeholders, they're not static. Stakeholders are dynamic. The variables are all dynamic. Attitudes change, behaviors change, options may change. The stakeholders themselves, the identity of the stakeholders may change. So one has to be able to see at different points in time throughout the project life cycle what is the stakeholder situation. How many stakeholders, who are the stakeholders, what is their attitude, what is their behavior, what options are they exercising, what are the trends, the anticipated trends in future, in the next phase, and the next phases. All these things one has to know. And this is where this process framework can be quite useful, because it can also help show insight, give insight into the stakeholder situation. Process framework also has a function of facilitating proactive project stakeholder management and engagement. This is something I had also just pointed out a few minutes earlier. Not only to look at stakeholders reactively, but to try and focus on them as proactively as one can. Proactive is sort of looking forward, anticipating, already thinking how they are going to act given a particular situation or circumstances which are prevailing at that time, and then to try and manage and engage them accordingly in such a manner that the stakeholders remain as supportive as possible to the project. So proactive is basically like, as I said on an analogy a few occasions, it's basically keeping fires from breaking out. Reactively is running to put out a fire after it has started. So, prevention is better than cure, as we say in medicine, and the same logic also applies here in the context of project stakeholder management and engagement. Try to prevent your stakeholders from becoming adversarial. Try to keep your stakeholders as supportive as possible, and this is where proactive strategies have got a high value. Not always successful, but usually they have a high value. There are some more basic functions which this project stakeholder management process framework can fulfill. Ensuring adherence to laws, regulations and policies which are applicable with regard to the project stakeholders. And the policies I had in the last class talked about Petro-Canada's stakeholder engagement policy and how important it is for the company. It has been emphasized that all its employees, all its operations, all its managers are adhering to this policy. Well, if you have a stakeholder management process framework in place where everything is documented, everything is carefully maintained in a database, well, then there should be no problem with regards to ensuring adherence of policies. The same applies to laws, the same applies to regulations which may be in existence. Laws have to be obeyed. And sometimes one does not even know about the existence of these laws, but they may be there. And this is where this process framework can be very helpful by keeping a record of everything, showing it to the persons concerned and making sure that they also adhere to it. Another function which this stakeholder management process framework fulfills is tracking transparency, accountability and the upholding of the project ethical standard. Now, I had pointed out in one of the previous lectures how important ethics is in the context of project stakeholder management, that basically it's the moral foundation of the whole subject of project stakeholder management and engagement. And this framework will ensure through its documentation, through its transparency, through the processes and the procedures which have to be followed, that the ethical standards are maintained to the maximum possible extent. Because everything is systematically structured, everything is documented, everything has to be followed as a reference, you can be sure that the information or the knowledge, the references which are there, they will also be passed on. Transparency will be there because tools are there to ensure that stakeholders are managed and engaged, who is managing and engaging them, at what time, in what manner, to what extent. All this is documented. There are special tools and all that for that which we'll also be looking at. So by documenting all this, by maintaining a record of all this, there is transparency, and from transparency also can come accountability later on. Have the standards been met with regards to stakeholders? Yes or no? Yes, okay, no, why not? What was the reason for that, and so forth. Another function of this stakeholder management process framework is that it provides insights which can benefit future projects. Going back to my illustration, this process framework diagram, the 5 steps, I had also pointed out that maturity levels can evolve. You can learn from your projects. What went right? What didn't go right? Why didn't it go right? What can be improved? Well, all these are insights which you can learn from projects, and these insights here in this context with regards to stakeholders, if they are properly documented and acted upon, well, then they can also benefit future projects, so that mistakes which were committed, say, on a previous project, can be avoided on a future project. The stakeholder management process framework also constitutes the basis for research studies. Well, you know, research is done when you have the relevant information in abundance, which is necessary in order to do your research. Well, this framework, it generates a lot of information through all the processes, through all the tools, through all the templates, etc., which are being applied therein. And all this information which is then collected, which is documented, which is cataloged, which is data-based, that can then be called up and it can be used for research studies, maybe doing a case study on stakeholders, or maybe doing a comparative study on stakeholders. All this is possible. Another basic function of the stakeholder management process framework is it demonstrates a professional approach and is a best project management practice. Well, this is also very relevant because, project management, stakeholder management, it's a professional activity and there should be a professional basis to it. And professional basis also requires that there is best practices are followed, that there is an element of standardization, and that everyone has got a good idea on how to go about in a very good way. So this process framework it shows that there is a professional approach which is being followed, the best possible which is available at this point in time. And it is also a best project management practice. And project management, we always are striving to continuously improve, to change for the better. And we're always on the lookout for best practices so that we can implement those best practices. And if we can find even better practices, then to adopt and implement those better practices. In this case, the stakeholder management process framework is a best practice. At the moment, there is no better practice than that. Nothing has been developed. Maybe one or more of you out there, after this course has been completed, and maybe if you like the subject, then you might like to come and do some research and see if you can come up with something better. Personally, I doubt it, but this is basically the idea, to apply best practices in project management. Whatever best practice there is good. The PMI, the PMBOK, is also based on best practices, based on years of observing projects in different categories across the globe. So this, in the case of stakeholder management and engagement, this is the best practice which is available at this point in time. So you can see here, going back these last few slides, that there are a large number of functions, basic or fundamental functions, which this project stakeholder management and engagement process framework, which I introduced in the previous lecture, is supposed to fulfill. It's very systematic, can be very detailed, and it provides quite a very large number of benefits which can help the project, facilitate the project, reduce risks to the project, and to reduce any sort of untoward incidents with regards to stakeholders, and ensure that the image and reputation of the project is also maintained. Having said that, the framework, of course, it has its limitations, it has its strengths, and some of the strengths I have just alluded to, and I'll just be briefly going over them again, but we also have to be mindful of the limitations which this framework has got. The framework, for a start, and now this is looking at the strengths of the framework, this framework offers a systematic, customizable, practical, and professional knowledge platform, inter alia, that is among other things, for identifying the project stakeholder community, analyzing its diverse concerns, expectations, power constellation, relationships, supportive and adversarial attitude and behavior towards the project, and effectively engaging stakeholders so that the project stays on track. So this is a very big strength of this framework. It's systematic, as we have seen. It's customizable. You can adapt it, you can modify it for the project. Some projects you might have very small stakeholder community. You might have a very small, localized, homogeneous stakeholder community, in which case you can use a simplified version of the framework. In other cases, you might have very large, spatially dispersed, diverse, heterogeneous stakeholder community, in which case you might have to apply a more significant version of the framework, more processes, more templates, more procedures, for instance. So there is this element of customizability. It's very practical and it's very professional, the most professional, as I said, at this point in time for dealing with stakeholders. This is a big strength of this framework. The framework also provides the means for designing and implementing customized and modifiable strategies of management engagement towards the project stakeholders. It's not that you just have a list of strategies for dealing with your stakeholders and you pick out this, this, and this. That's not the case. What the framework does is, it provides you with a lot of freedom, a lot of creative freedom, how to deal with your stakeholders. And as you will see when we talk about stakeholder engagement later on in this course, there are so many ways of engaging your stakeholders. It doesn't have to be a very particularly complicated way, also can be a very simple way, can be a very simple face-to-face discussion over a cup of tea, in which you can turn someone who is against your project into someone who is in favor of your project. So it's very flexible, it's very customizable, and the framework, actually as it is, it allows a lot of flexibility in managing and engaging stakeholders. It requires only, of course, that ethical standards are being upheld, policies are being upheld. It also takes into account your resource constraints, but other than that, it's really very, very flexible, and there are no sort of limits as to how you can manage and engage your stakeholders. The framework helps create better understanding of, and therewith increases the level of support for, the project among the stakeholders. It's a two-way road, really. The framework provides the internal stakeholders, those who have to come up with strategies for dealing with stakeholders, a big help. At the same time, it's also designed in a way in which other stakeholders, not necessarily only the internal stakeholders, but they also can understand the project in a better way. For instance, when you are talking about engagement and you talk about a novel communication strategy, well, this communication strategy also benefits the external stakeholders or the secondary stakeholders in the sense that it gives them information about the project. It tells them what's going on. It keeps them informed. It wants to listen to them also and to take their point of view, their feedback. So it's really a two-way road here. This framework brings great benefits for those who are managing and engaging project stakeholders. It also brings benefits for the stakeholders, secondary stakeholders or external stakeholders. The framework permits periodic revision of the stakeholder analysis with consequent modification of the stakeholder engagement strategies if and when the need for improvements are observed over time. Comes again back to what I said, that stakeholders are dynamic. Their interests may change, their attitudes may change, their behaviors may change, their exercise of options may change. Well, that is why you have to periodically review your stakeholders. Okay, you have done an analysis. That analysis might be very valid at that particular point in time, but maybe, say, 1 month down the line, or 2 months down the line, or 3 months down the line, that analysis of your stakeholders might not be so relevant anymore. And one has to redo the analysis because in the meantime the ground conditions have changed and the framework conditions have changed. So what this does basically is that it says that you have to periodically review your stakeholders, the identification of your stakeholders, the community. You have to review the analysis, you have to review their impact evaluation, and you have to review your engagement and management strategies. It doesn't mean that it must be done, but if there is a need for that, which one can also observe by collecting information on stakeholders, by observing them, which is also part of the framework, then there is a need to redo the analysis, redo the strategy design and implementation. A big benefit of the framework, also as I pointed out in one of the previous slides, is that it ensures transparency and accountability, which is a good project management practice. This is how we strive to do projects. We want transparency, we want accountability, we want good practices, preferably best practices which become better over time. And this is where this framework can help, because through the information, through the data which is collected by this framework, one can channel it back into improving the processes, into improving the strategies, improving the identification, improving the evaluation and the analysis of stakeholders. So all very large number of benefits which this framework has got. But having said that, one has to be mindful of the limitations. There are also a very large number of inherent limitations which are built into this framework. This process framework, for instance, it does not guarantee that all issues and complications encountered with stakeholders, especially those of serious nature, can and will be resolved. Okay, stakeholders are there, problems might be there, issues might be there, complications might be there. The framework, the stakeholder management and engagement process framework, can maybe identify what these issues are, what these problems are, what these complications are, but resolving them is of course very challenging, and even sometimes the best conceived engagement strategies might not be able to help much. Sometimes stakeholders can be very difficult to deal with. They can be very obstinate, they can be very unaccommodating, and they may be irrational, but still they can cause a lot of problems to your projects, no matter how much you do. And that's why I had also pointed out in one of the earliest classes of this course that stakeholder management it's not magic, and you cannot always solve all stakeholder issues with it. Stakeholder issues, to some extent or the other, will always be there. The main thing is one tries to keep them under control so that they don't become an obstacle for the project. But there are some cases where even the best stakeholder management and engagement may not work. So the process framework is not going to guarantee that all your problems will be overcome. But what it can only do is it can give you some help to try and overcome those problems, issues, and complications. Now, the application of this framework requires a lot of commitment, sustained commitment over time. It can be complex, time-consuming, and costly, especially if the stakeholder community is large, heterogeneous, and spatially dispersed. Okay, it's nice to have such frameworks, but some such frameworks also come at a cost. And we have to see that whether the project, whether the organization or organizations which are undertaking the project have the resources, have the patience, and have the commitment in order to implement or utilize such a process framework. If you have a stakeholder community which is very large, which is spread all over the place, and which is very diverse, then it's going to be challenging to go and identify all those stakeholders, to go and see what kind of attitudes they have got, to see what kind of behaviors they are exerting, what kind of options they may use. That may not be always a very realistic way. It might be a good way, a nice way, but it might not be a very realistic way. It might be too time-consuming. It might be too resource-intensive. And then one might be cutting corners. One might be leaving some stakeholders out who later on might turn out to be very important stakeholders. So this is one limitation of the process framework, that one requires a lot of sustained commitment as well as the resources in order to apply it. Another limitation is that the quality of stakeholder identification, analysis, and management engagement strategies depends on the informational input as well as the skill, experience, and creativity of the trained project staff. So the quality of identification, analysis, and strategies depends on the informational input. Information is the key input here in this framework. Now, information itself, this is a big topic in itself. Getting information, getting the right type of information, getting abundant information at the right time from the right sources and so forth. A lot of parameters of information are here. What one needs really is information which can be used to properly manage and engage project stakeholders in a manner which brings benefits to the project. It's not about each and every piece of information. It's about very specific pieces of information relevant to the project stakeholders, and which is then of course also relevant for how the project can benefit therefrom. Now, getting crucial information about the project stakeholders, it might be impossible sometimes to get. It might be difficult, or maybe too costly, or take too long to get. So, and of course this is a challenge, getting right information about the stakeholders, so that one can come up with a viable engagement and management strategy. Stakeholder interests, concerns, expectations, power, influence, perceptions, and support for or in opposition to the project may change considerably over time, even over very short periods of time. Recording and documenting rapid changes may be difficult, may not be possible. All these variables which are relating to stakeholders, which are relevant for the project, their interest in the project, their power, their concerns, their expectations, their perceptions, their support, etc., etc., etc. As I pointed out earlier, stakeholders are very dynamic, and the variables here are also very dynamic. So if you have a very large stakeholder community, and they have a very dispersed stakeholder community, and there's always this fluctuation taking place, today in favor of your project, tomorrow against your project, the day after indifferent, neither for nor against, up, down, all over the place. Well, it's becoming quite a challenge to document all that, to keep track of all that, And the more complex the project becomes, the more difficult it really becomes to do all that. So it may not be possible to devise management and engagement strategies which satisfy all the stakeholders. You can have very diverse stakeholders. Everyone has their interests, their self-interests, everyone has their concerns, and you can try and satisfy all or as many as you can, but usually it's very difficult to satisfy everybody. There's old saying, you can't satisfy everyone. Sometimes one has to be a little bit choosy in who one is satisfying over here. Obviously it's very nice if you can satisfy all your stakeholders, but practically it will be very, very difficult. More probably than not, it will be impossible to do. So one has then got to prioritize the stakeholders, whose interests or whose engagement should take priority over other stakeholders. So these are all large number of limitations, as you can see over here, large number of benefits, but also a very large number of limitations. That's why I put the thumb down. Thumb down means not good, thumb up means good regarding the framework. So just be mindful of these limitations. It's more like a conceptual tool, but a conceptual tool which in many instances can provide you with some practical guidance in how best to manage and engage your project stakeholders. Now, I would like to move on to the next step in the governance model, the 5-step governance model which I had developed. You remember there was institutional step, there was a directional step, there was what we have just been discussing, and in most of the previous class there was this instrumental step. Now I want to look at the technical step, which is a project stakeholder information system. And this has been made, well, information technology has greatly helped in developing such systems. Some organizations do have them, also on some projects. Information system. Information is basically about collecting all the information which is relevant to stakeholders. Again, I must emphasize, we don't want to overload with information. There is no point of collecting each and every detail about a stakeholder. We are concerned primarily with information which is useful for engaging the stakeholders and also useful for the project. Nowadays we use a lot of information communication technology, computers, laptops, networks, database systems. This is a modern and popular way of storing, processing and distributing project information. It has several significant advantages over the paper-based method over here, but of course it also has its drawbacks, and we'll also be looking at that in later class. For collecting information, storing information on stakeholders, you can use either electronic systems, or you can use here this old traditional paper system. Over here, paper-based, filing cabinets, archives, cataloging systems, versus electronic, which is PC, laptops, software, databases, networking, infrastructure, and so forth. You might have heard of the PMIS, that is the Project Management Information System, which contains all information relevant to a project or a program. Well, the PSIS, that is the Project Stakeholder Information System, that is one part of the PMIS. The PMIS contains a lot more information, technical information, other information which is not really stakeholder specific. The Stakeholder Information System, PSIS, contains all the information which is specifically relevant for stakeholders as part of the PMIS. And of course you can have all kinds of sub areas under here. You can have, for example, an area which contains all the identification information of stakeholders. You can have another area which has all the analysis information or evaluation information or strategy information and all the changes which are occurring over time and so forth. All this can come here in this system, along with all the other important things like ethics guidelines, laws, regulations, policies, strategies, case studies as a reference, for instance. All these things you could expect to find here under a project stakeholder information system. And since we are talking about information now, and I had also pointed out that information has got many parameters. When you talk about information, you should look at the different parameters, because they determine the quality of the information. A good quality information versus information which is not of good quality. Now, what really determines the quality? We want to have quality, because from quality information we can come up with better strategies. And if we come up with better, more effective, more efficient strategies, we are doing a service to the project. We are reducing risk to the project. We are conserving resources for the project. We are helping ensure that the project will be realized within its given parameters, its given resource constraints. Information is so important in project management, not only in stakeholder management. Every project, has got a technical dimension, has got a managerial dimension. And information here is very important, especially in the managerial dimension, which includes the stakeholder management. What are some of the parameters of information quality? Well, one parameter is the accuracy of the information, the factualness. Is it absolutely correct? The factualness, the correctness of the information, that it's absolutely right. Other things like the adequacy. Is it sufficient in order to come up with an analysis, for example? Is it sufficient to come up with an evaluation, or is some information missing which is needed in order to supplement it? So there is this adequacy dimension, relevancy. On stakeholders, you want to find out like their attitudes and their behaviors. you might not be interested in all other information about them. What shoe size do they wear? Or what is their favorite restaurant? What movies do they watch? Or what websites do they surf and all that? Unless it is relevant specifically in terms of coming up with an engagement strategy or understanding the stakeholders' attitudes and concerns towards the project. Currentness. Is the information current? I mean, is it outdated information which no longer applies, is of no use, or does it reflect the given current point in time? One wants to have current information. One does not want to be behind something which happened maybe long ago which is no longer valid now. Specific information. Of course, very specific information would be, is stakeholder X or stakeholder Y, are they in favor of the project? Are they against the project? Why specifically are they in favor? Why specifically are they against? What are their reasons? This specificity parameter of information. Reliability, that you can be assured that the information you get will be the same no matter from where you look for that information. It will be reliable. It is then also accurate. Information is actionable. You can take action on it based on that information. If you know, for example, that the stakeholder is against your project because he or she thinks that his or her property value may depreciate, may go down. Well, that is actionable information. Then you can act on that information and you can go to that stakeholder and you can say, no, that's not the case here. I have got some research studies which show that in other areas where these projects were undertaken, the property values have actually gone up. So your property value may actually go up as a result of this project. Proactive means, again, anticipatory, forward-looking. You can see trends which will be occurring over time, and you can use that information to come up with viable strategies. You can see into the future how stakeholders are expected to behave towards your project at a future point in time. Verifiable means that this information can be checked out from different sources, and you can see whether all the different sources are giving the same information. Source integrity. How good is the source of information? You might be getting information, say, from some newspaper about certain group of stakeholders, which might not be good information. It might not be the right information. It might be highly exaggerated. Some newspapers might say that, okay, for this project which is going on, most of the people are against it. Most of the stakeholders are against it. But I mean, how can you really say that this is correct or not? I mean, what is the integrity of that source of information? Is it a good source or is it not a good source? Some other parameters over here, the comprehensibility of information. How comprehensible is the information? Can you understand it? Is it given in a way in which makes sense? Affordability. How much does the information cost? Is it affordable? Usability. Can you use it, or are you not allowed to use it for some reason or the other? Is it integratable with your other sources of information, for example, with your databases? Is the information documentable? Is it transferable? Is it legal? Have you got it through legal means, or have you got it through some eavesdropping, spying, which may not be legal? And for how long is the information going to be valid? You have information that a stakeholder X is going to maybe go and get a stay order from the court, and then you want to know, well, for how long is this stakeholder going to actually think about getting a stay order? What is going to be the duration? So things like that. So you can see that there are a large number of parameters of information quality. Information is not exactly information. You have to look at it through the prism of all these different parameters, and it's only then when you have done that can you really get some idea as to whether or not this information is of a high quality. And you know the saying, garbage in, garbage out. So if you put some bad information in and you come up with a strategy, well then the strategy is probably not going to be very effective because it's really bypassing the real issues and is not exactly on target. So now I would like to come to the fifth step in this governance model. The fifth step, which I had mentioned in that illustration in the previous class, is the training and education component. Now, it's all very nice to have all processes, it's very nice to have policies, it's very nice to have fancy information systems, everything relating to stakeholders, but if you really don't have any clue as to who stakeholders are, as to why they are important for your project, as to why they must be engaged on your project, well, all these framework conditions and processes and infrastructure, etc., is not going to be of much help. In other words, you have to have this awareness of how important it is to manage stakeholders, and unfortunately this awareness has been neglected for a long time. It's picking up a lot now, as we have seen from our previous classes, but it has been neglected a long time because of this obsessive focus on technical issues. And now there's becoming a refocus which is going more towards the social context of projects, the stakeholder context of projects, the relationship context of projects. And this is where education and training can come in. Education and training can spread awareness about how important it is to manage and engage stakeholders. Now, this education and training, it can be insourced or it can be outsourced. Insourced, it can be done within the organization, or it can be outsourced to consultants or practitioners who are conducting subject-specific courses, seminars, workshops, what we all put under events relating to stakeholders, stakeholder management, stakeholder engagement. And as you know, as I pointed out, there are very few degree courses in the world. This is one of them. However, there are quite a large number of short courses on stakeholders, one-day courses or half-day courses or two-day courses, sometimes even longer-term courses. And over here you can see is I have given a few of them in which you just have to click on the links and then you can view the course details. What I want to do is I will just show you over here. I have brought some samples along. You can see over here there's a conference, a seminar, there's some workshops. This is just a few samples from my extensive database. Let us look at this one over here. Does this say cancel over here? This one over here. This is how many pages? 6 pages. You can see it's sponsored by, it's an event which is sponsored by several organizations. Public consultation and stakeholder engagement, 2 distinct essentials for major projects. You can see over here, a whole program is given over here. It's quite extensive. And if one goes back to the first page, this 2-day conference will explain why public consultation and stakeholder engagement are becoming increasingly critical to the success of all major projects. It will also explain why you need to address the 2 issues separately using dedicated strategies. It is no longer satisfactory to bundle public consultation and stakeholder engagement together. Now, this was already held in summer 2006, so 6-7 years ago, 13th and 14th of June. And here you can see all the speakers who have come. This is a member of parliament here, public affairs advisor, director, barrister, communication officer, head of development planning, director, chairman, lead organizer. You can see here that all these who are in the chair on day 1, day 2, seems to be a very extensive conference. Wish I could have attended. Anyway, what are the key questions to be discussed on the 13th of June, on the first day? Questions here is, why is public consultation becoming increasingly important for all major projects? Who are the public and how and when should they be consulted? What are the key factors in successful public consultation? What are the consequences of getting public consultation wrong? How can you increase the participation of minority groups, the socially excluded and other difficult to consult people? How can you reduce the power of objectors' arguments at the public inquiry? What types of public consultation are needed at the construction stage? How can the media be used to help with consultation, public consultation? It's very interesting. The first day deals with public consultation. The second deals mainly with stakeholder engagement. And then you can see here all the topics which are being discussed. Why is public consultation so crucial for projects? Best practice in public consultation. How should the promoters consult with the public? And so forth. Best practices in consultation. And for the second day, who are your stakeholders? What do they want? And are they all equally important? Why has stakeholder engagement become increasingly important? What are the ways, the keys to formulating and delivering a successful stakeholder engagement strategy? Why are your environmental impact assessment and environmental statements so important? Why do politicians and political groupings support or oppose the project, and why does the project need a public affairs strategy? Should you train your team in stakeholder management? How important is stakeholder support at a public inquiry? What approach do property owners take towards major projects, and how should they be engaged with? I mean, these are all points, which we have hinted at over here in this course already. So you can see here importance of public information, web-based approaches to public consultation, using the media, developing a stakeholder engagement strategy, communicate, etc. Best practices. All this is going on over here. So it's very, very useful, as you can see, relating. This is just one example of a 2-day very interesting conference. Now if we go and have a look at some other, here, let us take a look at this seminar. Cancel. Stakeholder Management Seminar, which was held in Dublin in Ireland. External communications for managers and engineers. Engaging stakeholders. Engaging stakeholders is now obvious for many. Engaging stakeholders is now obvious for many large infrastructure projects. There have been a number of high-profile projects delayed through stakeholder activism. Any major planning application involves a significant amount of effort regarding external communications. Communications is the basis of stakeholder management and engagement. Engaging stakeholders is not just limited to new build projects. In order to operate any plant or facility, managers must effectively engage with their local stakeholders on a range of issues such as environmental impact, expansion plans, health, safety, etc. And then it goes on and on and on. And you can see over here the seminar program, and these are some of the speakers. You can see here that this group of organizations here has got a stakeholder consultation unit. It's very good. And then there are also a lot of others who are here: project managers, communication managers, directors, local authority managers, Director Friends of the Earth, which is the environmental organization, crisis communications, local stakeholder management for manufacturing, communication aspects of large infrastructure projects. All this is stakeholder management and engagement. Maybe we'll look at a workshop also. This one over here. This is 2-page document, as you can see over here. One-day workshop in Calgary in Canada, measuring socio-political risk. Planners and owners of infrastructure and extractive projects of mining face socio-political risks, but until now have not had a solid way of quantifying them. This workshop focuses on measuring risk sources such as community or environmental opposition and investor nervousness resulting from a damaged, does it go on? Yeah, from a damaged something. Right, anyway. Early warning signs, public opinion surveys, social license, and so forth. All this is discovered over here. Stakeholder mapping techniques, do-it-yourself graphic mapping of your existing stakeholder network knowledge, dysfunctional patterns and the implementations for your company, win-win strategies for your organization community, tracking socio-political risk level over time. So all this is given over here. And this is one of the books also, which I wanted to recommend to you, Stakeholder Politics, by this gentleman over here, Robert Boutelier. He's a French-Canadian, and he has also done a lot of work on project stakeholder management and engagement. And this is also something which you might like to have a look at. Well, anyway, I can go on and on and on, which I really don't want to. The point here was just to illustrate that there are lots and lots of educational resources out there. Even if they're not full-fledged degree courses like this one, there are a lot of educational resources which are also very interesting. And if you can attend one of them sometime in the coming years, that will be very good. And it will really deepen your insights into the subject. Now, what I want to do is, from the next lecture onwards, from lecture 15 onwards, we'll starting going into this process framework, contextualization, identification of project stakeholders, and we'll be going over various ways of doing that and various tools, processes, and so forth. So that was all for today. In this class and in the previous class, we've talked about the governance model, and we've talked about the project stakeholder management and engagement process framework as one of the components of the 5-step stakeholder management and engagement governance model. And from next week, we'll be focusing on the instrumental step. As you know, this contextualization, identification are the first steps of this process framework, which is what we will start looking at. So thank you all very much for your patience, and I will see you all again very soon. Thank you.